Hello, welcome to Summerfest Online 2020. Thank you very much for coming along to view these presentations. Just a quick reminder that we have a number of exhibitors in the exhibitors hall. If you want to go along and have a quick browse, maybe do some shopping, then we'd love to see you. And a quick reminder too about our wonderful sponsors, Yayo Hemp Products and Butte Island Cheese. They're also in the exhibitors hall and they'd love to see you too. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember this is a free event, and if you'd like to make a small donation, you'd be very welcome. Please go to the Friends of VegFest page to make a donation. And a reminder too, we have another show in November, London Online, and in next March, Plant Powered Expo. And you can find out all about that on VegfestUK. Thanks very much and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sue Kenneally and I'm here to talk to you about plants, nature's real comfort foods. So a little bit about me. I'm a GP and a bariatric physician and a nutritionist, and I'm also on the advisory board of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and I'm the nutrition lead for the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, and I do have a particular interest in nutrition and pain. So on the menu for this talk, we'll look at what pain is, we'll look at how diet can affect pain, think about some painful conditions, and then ultimately the anti-inflammatory diet, which I believe and have seen plenty of evidence for the fact that it helps with reducing a lot of painful conditions. So let's think about types of pain. The first thing to say, the picture on the left-hand side, is to illustrate the fact that pain is actually our friend. If we didn't feel pain, life would be pretty dangerous. We wouldn't know when we were getting burned or scalded. We wouldn't know when there was something wrong in our body necessarily. We wouldn't feel things like damage to our toes when we get diabetic neuropathy and that kind of thing. So it's really, really important that we are able to feel pain. The problem comes when we get chronic pain, which our body wasn't designed to deal with. And when it comes to pain, there are two types really that can be affected by diet, and fairly obviously those are psychological or mental pain and physical pain. So we'll have a look at both of those. So can food really help? A lot of people, even a lot of doctors, don't appreciate how much diet can affect our pain. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that food can either increase or decrease chronic pain, and some foods are a very effective drug in the short term. The problem comes when those foods are eaten in excess, because in the long term they actually cause more pain by increasing inflammation. We'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. Other foods relieve pain in the long term, which is fantastic news. And of course, compared with drugs, food, generally speaking, is free of side effects and doesn't interact with any other medication, and of course is widely available and you don't need a prescription for it. So if you can manage your pain through diet, that's very empowering and quite freeing, and it's also very effective. Traditional comfort foods, yes, there are plenty of foods out there that people classically reach for if they're in pain, whether it's emotional pain, mental pain, or actual physical pain. There are foods that absolutely make us feel better, and so those pictures illustrate some of them. There are the burgers and fries, so the salty fatty food. Then there's the pure sugar, the sweets, and then on the right hand side there's chocolate cake, which is probably more addictive than the other two, because essentially foods that comfort us in this way, at least, do so by affecting the pleasure center in our brains. And I'll talk about this more later, but essentially they do this through the mechanisms of salt, fat and sugar. So these three ingredients affect the pleasure center in our brains in different ways, but if you take them in just the right combination, they can have an absolutely massive effect. And cake in particular contains salt, fat and sugar in just the right amount to act like a pretty serious drug, and that's why a lot of people turn to it when they're hurting. So the problem with traditional comfort foods is, yes, they're absolutely effective at the time. They can be a really effective drug, but in the long term, they put us at risk of gaining weight. They increase the amount of inflammation in our body. They cause things like diabetes, which can be really painful, and various other health conditions which can all increase our pain in the long term. So while they might be comfort foods immediately, and that really does work, in the long term they're more of a problem. So nature's real comfort foods, as in this slide, are the ones that reduce our weight, reduce our risk of diabetes, reduce our risk of chronic pain in the long term. And they're not the ones that we traditionally reach for when we're hurting, because they don't give us that buzz like the comfort foods do. But in the long term, they really do help and heal us and reduce our pain. So they are the real comfort foods. Of course, telling people with chronic pain that they need to eat unprocessed fruits and vegetables and a simple diet that doesn't stimulate their pleasure centre in the same way as comfort food does can be a challenge for them. If they've been in pain for a while, it's quite likely they've probably already developed a strong preference for traditional comfort foods because they really do help in the short term. And of course, there are other concerns. They may have physical limitations because of their health condition that's causing the pain. They may have reduced motivation because of the pain and low mood. So the thought of getting out and buying healthful food and then preparing food from scratch to eat and taking a lot of time and effort over it might not be as appealing as the quick fix, which is cheaper and easier and more accessible. They may, of course, have financial limitations through loss of work, and they might perceive that they don't have the money to spend on the healthful fruits and vegetables and so on, and they might see the cheaper, easier meal as something that they have to do because they don't have quite so much money as they used to. And of course, this is particularly frustrating because if they have chronic pain, they are one of the groups of people who have the most to gain from the anti-inflammatory diet. So of all the people that would need to hear this and prepare these meals from scratch, they are the ones who would benefit the most. So exactly how does diet affect pain? What's the actual underlying mechanism? Well, there are several, but the four with the most evidence for them are the opioid-like effects, the anti-inflammatory effects, changes in the microbiome, and changes to epigenetics. So let's have a look at these four in a little bit more detail. So firstly, opioids. When we talk about opioids, most of us think about opioid painkillers. These are things like cocodamol or tramadol or morphine, those kinds of things, really quite strong painkillers. And these drugs have their effects by stimulating what's known as opioid receptors in our bodies. And of course, it makes sense that if we have opioid receptors in our bodies, then we must have access to opioids in other ways, not just from drugs that we've artificially created. And it's true that a lot of substances and a lot of things that naturally happen to us as part of our physiology can result in opioid-like substances affecting those opioid receptors and having the same kind of effects as morphine, but just in a much smaller way. And food is one of those things. Food can sit on opioid receptors and stimulate them in the same way as morphine, just in a much weaker way, but it can have a noticeable effect. So that's one way that food can relieve pain. And let's think about anti-inflammatory effects. So a lot of pain is due to inflammation, and anything in the body which can help to reduce inflammation, in theory, can reduce pain, and that's certainly true of diet. There are several different plant-based foods which have anti-inflammatory effects, and these will be fruits and vegetables and grains and legumes and probably others besides, and they all have slightly different anti-inflammatory effects. This is why it's important to eat a mixed, varied diet with lots of different nutrients and lots of different ingredients throughout any day or week. The more varied your diet is, the more anti-inflammatory chemicals you're going to be introducing into your body, and the more varied and balanced they are, the more anti-inflammatory effects you're going to see. There's a lot of research out there about the different anti-inflammatory effects that different foods have, and which ones cause a reduction in CRP and which ones cause a reduction in interleukin 6. And you don't even need to know these names really, but there are a lot of inflammatory molecules out there and a lot of different ways that different foods reduce the effects that the inflammatory molecules can have. I think the most important thing to know is that that's one of the many reasons why nutritionists advise that we should eat a rainbow. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables with lots of different colours, because they all have slightly different effects, and together they add to an awesome and very anti-inflammatory whole. Now let's think about the microbiome. The microbiome is essentially all of the small organisms, essentially bacteria and similar, that live in and on us. We have them on our skin and we have them throughout our digestive tract. And like most things, they can be our friend or they can be our enemy. And they were designed to be our friend. There are different types of gut bugs, and when I'm talking about microbiome in the context of pain, I'm probably talking about the ones that exist in our digestive tract rather than the ones that are on our skin. And there are different types of gut bugs depending on the diet that we eat. So if we eat a healthful, simple, unprocessed plant-based diet, then that encourages the growth of some particular types of gut bugs. And if we eat a standard Western pro-inflammatory diet, then that encourages the growth of completely different gut bugs. And not surprisingly, the ones that tend to thrive when we eat an unprocessed plant-based diet are the ones that are the most anti-inflammatory, and the ones that tend to thrive when we eat an inflammatory diet are the ones that tend to be inflammatory. The good news is that the species that grow in our guts really can change very quickly in response to a change in our diet. And that's good from an evolutionary perspective because we used to have to just manage to eat with whatever we could find. So one day we'd eat fruits and vegetables and roots and nuts and seeds, and then another day somebody would successfully hunt an animal. Then we'd eat meat for a while, and then eventually we'd run out of meat and go back to eating the plant-based diet again. And our gut bugs would change accordingly. So that's really good news because it means that if you change to a healthful diet from a standard Western diet, your gut bugs will be very happy to come with you and they'll change very quickly for you. And lastly for this slide, there's epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how we can modify our genetic expression. So we know, for example, that our genetic code is fixed. Our genes are found in our DNA and we're born with them and we can't change the structure of them. Our genes are fixed unless we damage them throughout life. So say, for example, you're destined to have blonde hair and blue eyes because of your genes. There's nothing we can do to change that. You will have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's fixed. But there are plenty of genes which are in your DNA, but you don't necessarily express them fully, and the extent to which you express them can be modified by lifestyle. There are a number of aspects that affect how much we express those genes, and in terms of lifestyle, the things that affect it most are physical activity, sleep, stress, our physical environment, and of course diet, which is why it's part of this talk. The idea is that lifestyle can switch these genes on or off. So if you live a healthy lifestyle, you'll find that you can switch on lots of healthy genes that then are anti-inflammatory. And equally, if you live an unhealthy lifestyle, what will happen is that these genes will get switched off and the genes associated with long-term pain and long-term health problems tend to get switched on. And I'm sure it's no surprise at all to find out that a healthy, unprocessed, plant-based diet is the one that's associated with switching on all the healthy genes, and the standard Western diet with lots of pro-inflammatory substances like meat and refined oils and refined flour and sugar are the ones that switch on the bad genes that are associated with chronic disease and chronic pain. So let's have a look at some health conditions that can be affected by diet, and let's start with arthritis. Largely speaking, there are two types of arthritis. There's inflammatory arthritis and wear and tear arthritis, and diet is particularly useful for inflammatory arthritis. The two main types of inflammatory arthritis that diet can help are rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. For rheumatoid arthritis, the evidence is that Mediterranean and vegan diets are the most effective, and for psoriatic arthritis, maintaining a healthy weight and intermittent fasting are also beneficial, and there's quite a lot of evidence for plant-based diets as well in psoriasis. For osteoarthritis, the evidence is less strong. It's mainly about maintaining a healthy body weight, and we know that eating a plant-based diet is the most effective diet for maintaining a healthy weight, and there's some evidence that curcumin and turmeric may help too. That said, a lot of patients who transition to a plant-based diet do notice that their osteoarthritis does get a lot better, even though there's not as much evidence for it as there is for rheumatoid and psoriasis. Let's have a look at a couple of examples of programs and things that have worked. So the Paddison program is famously available for people who suffer with rheumatoid arthritis, and it isn't just about diet, it's about other things as well, and it has had its critics in the social media, but overall it's had a lot of success. It advocates a whole food plant-based diet as part of the toolkit, and a lot of people have said that their rheumatoid arthritis has cleared up. And in fact, I've had a number of colleagues and patients who've adopted this way of eating, and they have confirmed to me absolutely that their arthritis has reduced or even resolved. And I've seen people stop taking their strong anti-rheumatoid medication and be pain-free just from changing their diet in this way. And then on the right of this slide is a picture of the book called The Kitchen Fairy Tale. And it was written by Ida, who's the lady in the picture on the front, and she has essentially healed her psoriatic arthritis by changing her diet to a whole food plant-based one with no oil. And it's called A Kitchen Fairy Tale because she healed herself in her kitchen and now she's living happily ever after. So these are just some examples of commercially available a book and a program out there that can give you more information about arthritis and diet. And as I say, I've seen both of these work in real life. Moving on to abdominal pain, in particular thinking about inflammatory bowel disease. Inflammatory bowel disease is largely Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. And there's now a growing body of evidence that suggests that inflammatory bowel diseases like this can be markedly improved on a plant-based diet. Gastroenterologists who prescribe a plant-based diet to their patients say that very often they see a reduced severity of the flares of inflammatory bowel disease, and they also see the symptoms reducing in frequency such that they can reduce their patients' medication and see marked problems with symptoms. And there have been a number of cases of inflammatory bowel disease reported in the medical literature where there's actually been remission and the patient becomes symptom-free in the long term. Let's think about excess weight for a while. Overweight and obesity are associated with chronic inflammation and significant chronic pain, both because of the physical changes in the body and the overall pro-inflammatory state. They also increase your risk of things like diabetes and heart disease and arthritis, and of course these things in and of themselves can be painful. We know that plant-based diets are the ones most associated with healthy body weight. If you look at the studies of Seventh-day Adventists, then they eat very different diets, although they're healthy diets, but a lot of their lifestyles otherwise are the same. So they all live in community, they all have great purpose, they believe in physical activity, and so things that might ordinarily confuse or confound the results of studies are less of a problem in their case because apart from diet, they live very similar lifestyles. That's quite different to a lot of other people in the Western world, where you might see that somebody who eats a healthy diet has fewer health problems, but it's likely that someone who eats a healthy diet also does more exercise and manages their stress better and is more health conscious overall. So it's difficult to say that the results that you're seeing are because of the diet. When it comes to the Seventh-day Adventists, because they live a generally healthy lifestyle overall, any difference that you do see is more likely to be due to their different diets. And in Seventh-day Adventists at least, the omnivores had the highest body mass index up at around 29.6, which is just below obese. The vegetarians had a body mass index of 25 point something, which is just into the overweight range, whereas the vegans, the plant-based ones, had the body mass index of 23, which is just about in the middle of the healthy range and where we ought to be aiming for. Some other effects of plant-based diet related to weight: they have the most beneficial effects on the hormones that regulate hunger and appetite, so that these things get regulated more efficiently and we're less likely to gain weight. And plant-based diets also affect epigenetics and the microbiome in ways that help us to regulate our weight more effectively. Now a couple of thoughts about psychological pain. We've talked about physical pain a fair bit. Now it's time to think about mood. We know that chronic pain is associated with an increased risk of anxiety or depression, and this should come as no surprise. It makes sense. If you're in pain all of the time, it's almost certainly going to get you down. And there's also evidence that changing your diet so that your mood increases and you feel a bit happier probably improves how you view your pain. So you may have the same amount of pain, but you may view it more optimistically or positively, or you might actually feel less of it. So increasing your mood is always a good thing if you have chronic pain. We already know that a generally healthy diet can improve mood. There's a lot of evidence for that. But more recently, we've seen trials where reducing consumption of animal-based products in omnivores has led to an improvement of mood. So that's some more evidence for plant-based diets and mood. And in a nice review in a recent book called The Brain Changer, there's evidence that diets higher in whole foods, including fruits, vegetables, cereals, beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, admittedly fish and olive oil, are consistently associated with a lower risk of depression, while diets high in junk food, even the vegan junk food, so that's the refined flour, refined sugar and salt and alcohol and those kind of foods, they're consistently associated with higher risk of depression, and animal products would be included in this as well. So junk food diets, they feel great at the time, but in the long term they really do increase your risk of depression. And I just wanted to add this slide to briefly mention that a whole food plant-based diet isn't just beneficial for pain. So we know that it markedly reduces your risk of heart disease, it lowers your risk of dementia, it can reduce your risk of abdominal pain from things other than inflammatory bowel disease, so things like heartburn and irritable bowel and those kinds of conditions can all get better with a whole food plant-based diet. And overall you have a lower risk of some types of cancer if you eat a whole food plant-based diet, and of course cancer itself can be a very painful condition, so reducing your risk of that can also be beneficial if you're trying to avoid pain. So a brief summary. We've learned in the last 20 minutes or so that food can often worsen or relieve pain depending on what you eat. And the trouble is that the foods that typically provide an instant fix makes things worse in the long term, but they really do help at the time. Whereas a whole food plant-based diet isn't the obvious choice if you're in pain and you're suffering, and it doesn't provide the instant fix that we know makes you feel so good, but in the longer term, it's a wiser choice. This can be a particularly difficult choice for people with chronic pain to make because of the likelihood of them having low mood and low motivation because of their pain, and maybe the financial circumstances and physical limitations. But if they can find a way to eat a whole food plant-based diet despite their pain, it's quite likely they're going to see a significant benefit. We learned that a healthful diet has many of the same effects as prescription painkillers in the sense that it's anti-inflammatory and can act like those opioids. And also that a number of chronic painful conditions can be improved or even completely resolved with diet, particularly a whole food plant-based diet. And the situation really is win-win, because what's good for pain is good for the rest of our health. A whole food plant-based diet, if it's well planned and stuck to fairly sensibly, can benefit just about any health condition and can keep us healthy and help us to age well. So thank you for listening. That's all from me. I've been Dr. Sue Kenneally. If you have any questions, do feel free to get in touch with the information on this slide, and I'll be happy to help. Thanks very much.